Elara Sinclair found herself positioned before Julian Croft's imposing desk, her hands locking together in her lap, as if to hold herself in one piece. The expensive leather of the chair felt unnervingly cold against her skin, a subtle reminder that she did not belong here. Julian's gaze remained fixed on the document spread before him, and the only sound piercing the heavy silence was the faint, rhythmic scratching of his pen, a noise that amplified the frantic beat of her own heart. At long last, Julian placed his pen down with deliberate slowness, leaning back to regard her with the same cool, calculating expression she had come to know so well. "Elara," he began, his voice a smooth, distant melody, "I have a feeling this isn't a professional matter." Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had mentally rehearsed this very moment countless times, yet now, under his unwavering stare, the words felt trapped in her throat. She took a sharp, difficult breath and willed herself to speak. "No, it's not," she managed, her voice a fragile whisper, as her eyes fell to her own tightly clasped hands. I'm pregnant." The silence that descended was absolute, a suffocating void that seemed to press in on her from all sides. Julian remained perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask, as if her words had been nothing more than a passing breeze. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity, each one heavier than the last, until finally his voice cut through the stillness. "I see, that was all. Nothing more." Elara blinked, her pulse still racing like a trapped bird. "It's yours, Julian," she added, struggling to keep her voice from trembling. "I believed you had a right to know." Julian let out a soft sigh, leaning forward to rest his elbows on the polished wood of his desk, his fingers forming a steeple in front of him. "Elara," he started again, his tone now cool and meticulously measured, "this is unfortunate. The word echoed in her mind, disbelief lacing through her voice as it wavered. Unfortunate? She had braced herself for shock, perhaps even fury, but not this. This chilling indifference. "Yes," Julian confirmed, his eyes locking onto hers, his expression now utterly devoid of warmth. "You ought to have exercised more caution." A knot of sickness twisted in her gut. We were careful." "Clearly not careful enough," he retorted, his words like shards of ice piercing her soul. He leaned back once more, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "And you're bringing this to me now because you—" "What? You expect me to do something about it?" Elara's throat constricted. She hadn't dared to think this far, had never imagined he would be so utterly cold, so dismissive. "I thought you would want to know," she said, her voice barely audible. "I thought perhaps we could figure something out." Julian's features hardened into a grim mask. "Yeah, figure something out?" "Elara, you understand how this world operates. I am a married man. I have a family, a reputation to uphold." He gestured between them, a dismissive flick of his hand. This was never meant to be anything more than what it was. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She had been a fool, she saw that now with painful clarity. The late nights in this very office, the whispered promises, the stolen moments. She had allowed herself to believe it was something real. To him it had always been a temporary, disposable affair. Elara straightened her spine, mustering the last vestiges of her courage. "I'm keeping the baby, Julian." He sighed again, a sound of pure exasperation, as he rose from his chair and walked around the desk to stand before her. "I cannot be involved in this, Elara. You must understand that. This conversation, it never took place. Do you comprehend?" Her blood ran cold. "What? You're simply walking away?" "I have no other choice," he stated, his voice firm yet eerily calm, "and you should do the same." Elara pushed herself to her feet, a slow-burning anger finally igniting in her chest. "I can't just walk away from this, Julian. This is your child, too." Julian's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in his cheek. "Elara, I am warning you. Let this go. I have been generous to you, but if you attempt to make this a problem for me, I will ensure you live to regret it." Her heart plummeted. "What are you saying?" He didn't answer immediately, instead returning to the sanctuary of his desk. When he settled back into his chair, his expression was as cold and hard as granite. I am saying that today is your final day at Croft Enterprises." Elara froze, the words failing to register. "What? You will be discreetly let go. I've already communicated with HR." His tone was chillingly businesslike, impersonal. "You will receive a severance package, naturally. But as of this moment, you are no longer an employee of this company." The finality of his statement hit her like a wave. "You're firing me? Because I'm pregnant? Because of you. I am protecting my family, Elara, and you should focus on protecting yourself." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "If you ever try to come after me, I will make certain you never find work in this industry again." Elara's hands began to shake, a storm of fury and disbelief raging within her. She stood there, staring at the man she had once allowed herself to trust, the man who now viewed her as nothing more than a liability. She swallowed the lump forming in her throat. "I never imagined you would do something like this." "You never should have imagined anything else," Julian replied, his voice maintaining its unnerving calm, as if this were just another transaction, another deal to be closed. Elara's vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. She would not cry in front of him. She would not grant him that satisfaction. Without another word, she spun on her heel and walked out of his office. Her journey back to her desk felt surreal, her legs moving on their own accord. Her hands worked mechanically, packing her personal belongings into a small box, each item feeling heavier than the last. Inside the elevator, descending to the lobby, she stared at her own reflection in the polished steel walls, desperately trying to hold herself together. But inside, she was shattering into a million pieces. Her career, her future, all of it had been stolen from her in a matter of minutes. And now she was alone, pregnant, jobless, and blacklisted from the very industry she had fought so hard to conquer. The tears finally came when she stepped out onto the bustling street, feeling utterly invisible, just another face in the anonymous crowd. No one would ever know the truth. Julian Croft had made certain of that, but as she walked away from the towering building that had once represented her future, she placed a protective hand on her stomach where a new life was just beginning. She wasn't entirely alone. She still had her child, and somehow together they would survive. The morning light sliced through the blinds in Kaelan's bedroom, painting long, dramatic shadows across the floor. He stood before the mirror, fumbling with his tie for what felt like the 10th time. It was his first day at Croft Enterprises, and a current of nervous energy was buzzing just beneath his skin. "Looking sharp," he whispered to his reflection, attempting to build his own confidence as he squared his shoulders. From the kitchen, the distinct whistle of a kettle boiling for tea cut through the morning silence. Kaelan could hear his mother moving about, the familiar sounds of her starting her day. A smile touched his lips as he imagined how proud she would be when he returned home later, filled with stories from his new, important job. He glanced at his phone 5 minutes before he had to leave. Just enough time to get his mother's blessing. He walked into the kitchen to find Elara already at the small round table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug. She looked up as he entered, her lips forming a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mom, how do I look?" Kaelan grinned, doing a small spin to show off his new suit. "First day at Croft Enterprises. This is a big deal, right?" Elara nodded slowly, her fingers tightening their grip on the mug. "Yes, Kaelan. It's big." Kaelan stopped, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. Something in her voice was off. The unbridled excitement he had expected to see in her was absent, replaced by a deep-seated worry. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked, pulling out a chair to sit across from her. "You don't seem as happy about this as I thought you'd be." Elara's gaze dropped to the steam coiling up from her tea, her eyes avoiding his. "I'm happy for you. I don't know about that place." Kaelan's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "It's Croft Enterprises. It's one of the most prestigious insurance firms in the nation. This could be life-changing for me, for us." "I know, baby," she said, her voice so soft it was almost lost to the air. "But that place—" "It's not what you think it is." He stared at her, the confusion mounting. "What are you talking about? Did you know someone who worked there? Is that what has you so worried?" Elara's hand trembled slightly around the mug, and Kaelan saw her knuckles turn white. Her lips pressed into a thin, hard line, and for a fleeting moment he thought she was about to reveal something more. Instead, she just shook her head, her gaze still fixed on her tea. "It's nothing like that. I just want you to be careful, that's all." Kaelan leaned back, trying to decipher her sudden shift in mood. His mother had always been his greatest champion, relentlessly pushing him to aim higher, telling him he was capable of achieving anything he set his mind to. But now, on the brink of his greatest achievement, she seemed to be pulling back. "Careful?" he repeated, a hint of frustration coloring his tone. "Mom, this is what we've been working towards for years. I didn't struggle through all that schooling and those unpaid internships for nothing. This job could change our entire lives." "I know," she said, finally looking up at him, her eyes clouded with an emotion that looked unsettlingly like fear. "But not everything is as it appears," Kaelan frowned, leaning forward again. "What's going on, Mom? Why are you saying all this now? You were thrilled when I first told you I got the job." Elara hesitated once more, and Kaelan could feel the tension between them thickening, like a heavy, unspoken secret hanging in the air. He couldn't understand what had changed. I just don't want you to get hurt," she finally said, her voice a fragile whisper. "Some places, they have shadows, Kaelan. Things you don't see until it's too late." His frown deepened. "Shadows? Mom, it's a job. It's an opportunity. I'm not some kid walking into a trap. This is going to help us. It's going to help you." Elara's shoulders slumped, and in that moment she looked infinitely older than he had ever seen her. "Just be careful, Kaelan. Promise me." His own frustration softened as he saw the weight she was carrying, even if he couldn't understand its source. "I'll be careful, I promise, but you have to trust me. I've worked so hard for this, and I'm not going to let anything spoil it." She managed to nod, though the worry never fully left her eyes. "I trust you, Kaelan." "I always have." He stood checking his watch again. "I have to head out. I'll call you later, okay?" Elara offered a smile, though it was thin, as if it cost her something precious. "Good luck, baby." Kaelan kissed her on the forehead, grabbed his briefcase, and started for the door. But just before he stepped out, he glanced back. She was still sitting at the table, staring down into her tea, her face etched with tension. For the first time, a flicker of doubt entered his own mind, but he quickly pushed it away. This was his moment, and nothing was going to stop him. The subway ride into the city's heart felt like the start of something momentous. Kaelan stood in the packed car, his hand gripping a cool metal pole as his thoughts raced. This was the culmination of everything he had worked for, the first real step in a long and successful career, and he refused to let his mother's cryptic warning cloud his mind. Croft Enterprises was one of the biggest names in the business. They didn't hire just anyone. He had competed against hundreds of other applicants to secure this position. If his mom was anxious, it was likely just her nerves. After all, this was a massive change, and perhaps she was simply afraid of what it meant for their future. He would talk to her about it later, when she was feeling more settled. Emerging from the subway station, Kaelan paused at the base of the Croft Enterprises building. The glass tower soared above him, sleek and formidable, its mirrored surface catching the morning sun and shimmering like something from a futuristic dream. He took a deep, steadying breath and squared his shoulders. This is it, he thought. This is where everything begins. Inside, the lobby was a grand expanse of marble and steel, filled with the quiet, purposeful hum of professionals moving with swift determination. Kaelan checked in at the reception desk, and within minutes he was being escorted upstairs by his new supervisor, Ms. Sterling, a no-nonsense woman with piercing eyes and a brisk, energetic pace. "Welcome aboard, Kaelan," she said, as they stepped into the elevator. "We're expecting great things from you." "Thank you, ma'am," Kaelan replied, his nerves transforming into a thrill of pure excitement. "I'm ready to hit the ground running." Ms. Sterling gave him a short, approving nod. "Good. Let's hope you live up to that potential." They moved through the open-plan office, a modern maze of cubicles and glass-walled conference rooms. Everything was pristine, high-tech, and humming with focused energy. People were absorbed in their work, barely glancing up as he passed. He could feel the intensity of the environment, the unspoken pressure to perform. As they navigated the floor, Kaelan saw him, Julian Croft, the CEO himself, engaged in conversation with a group of senior executives. Kaelan felt a surge of admiration. This was the man who had built this entire company from nothing, a man who represented everything Kaelan aspired to become. But as they passed, Julian's gaze flickered in his direction. For a fraction of a second their eyes met, and Kaelan felt a strange jolt, as if a circuit had been completed. Julian's expression remained neutral, professional, yet there was something in his eyes, a brief, almost imperceptible flicker of recognition, like a shadow passing over his features. Then just as quickly it was gone. Julian turned back to his colleagues without a second glance. Kaelan shook off the peculiar sensation and kept walking. It was probably just his imagination. Julian Croft didn't know him from anyone. He was just another new hire. Still, the look lingered in the back of his mind as Ms. Sterling led him to his desk and began outlining his first assignments. As the day progressed, Kaelan immersed himself in his work, the exhilaration of this new beginning pushing aside any lingering doubts. This was where he belonged, and he was determined to prove it. But even as he threw himself into the tasks at hand, his mother's words echoed in his head. Some places have shadows, Kaelan. Things you don't see until it's too late. He shook his head, trying to clear the thought. He wasn't in any danger. He was here to succeed. Whatever shadows his mother feared, they couldn't touch him. Not here, not now. The office had found its mid-morning rhythm, a quiet symphony of clicking keyboards and hushed conversations that filled the open space. Kaelan sat at his new desk, his fingers moving swiftly across the keys as he absorbed the company's workflow. Ms. Sterling, his supervisor, had given him a mountain of documents to review, and while the work itself was manageable, the sheer weight of the corporate environment was palpable. Croft Enterprises was a place of serious ambition, and everyone around him seemed to be operating at maximum focus. But no matter how hard he tried to concentrate, his mind kept replaying that fleeting moment in the hallway. Julian Croft's eyes meeting his for a split second, that strange flicker of something that looked like recognition. Kaelan frowned, his fingers momentarily stilling on the report in front of him. It made no sense. Julian Croft had no reason to know him, couldn't possibly know him. He was just one new face in a company of hundreds, perhaps thousands. Why would the CEO even notice him? He forced the thought away. It had to be nerves, first-day jitters. Kaelan had always been one to overthink things, especially when the stakes were high. He needed to focus, to prove his worth, to show the higher-ups that he belonged in this high-powered world. Lunchtime arrived and passed in a blur. Kaelan ate at his desk, unwilling to waste a moment. He had heard the stories. Croft Enterprises was a cutthroat environment where performance was everything, and he had no intention of falling behind. The reports were dense and complex, but he pushed through them, driven by a determination to make a stellar first impression. Yet, as the afternoon stretched on, that unsettling feeling from the morning began to creep back in. It wasn't just the way Julian Croft had looked at him. There was something else, an undercurrent he couldn't quite name, something lurking just beneath the polished surface of the company. It wasn't until later, when Mrs. Sterling stopped by his desk to check on his progress, that the unease solidified. "You're doing well, Kaelan," she commented, glancing over his shoulder at his screen. "Good pace." "Thank you," Kaelan replied, leaning back to stretch his shoulders. "Just trying to get up to speed." "You're handling it just fine. Keep it up." She began to walk away, but then she paused, turning back with a more serious expression. "Oh, and I nearly forgot. Mr. Croft wants to see you in his office. Now." Kaelan blinked, processing her words. "Mr. Croft?" "Yes." She offered no further explanation. "He's on the 40th floor. You can head up." Ms. Sterling walked away without another word, leaving Kaelan sitting at his desk, stunned. Why on earth would Julian Croft want to see him, especially on his first day? His heart began to pound a heavy rhythm against his ribs as he stood and straightened his jacket. This wasn't standard procedure, was it? CEOs didn't just summon new hires out of the blue. He glanced around at his new colleagues, but they were all absorbed in their work, oblivious. Kaelan made his way to the elevator, his palms growing slick with sweat. He tried to rationalize it, to steady his breathing. This could be a good thing, right? Maybe Julian had seen something impressive in his application, something that made him stand out. Perhaps he simply wanted to personally welcome him to the team. But even as he tried to calm his nerves, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a darker possibility, and his mother's words echoed once more. Some places have shadows. When the elevator doors slid open on the 40th floor, Kaelan was met by an entirely different world. The executive floor was hushed and polished, with vast floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the space in the golden afternoon light. Everything about this level, from the sleek minimalist furniture to the plush carpet that muffled his footsteps, radiated power and importance. He approached the receptionist's desk, trying to ignore the knot that was tightening in his stomach. "I'm here to see Mr. Croft, Kaelan Sinclair." The receptionist, a woman with impeccable posture and a practiced smile, nodded and gestured toward a pair of large wooden doors behind her. "He's expecting you." "You can go right in." Kaelan hesitated, his nerves now at a fever pitch. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the heavy doors and stepped into Julian Croft's office. The room was immense, with a panoramic view of the city skyline that instantly made Kaelan feel small and insignificant. Julian was seated behind a massive mahogany desk, his back to the window, glancing over some papers. He didn't look up right away, leaving Kaelan standing frozen in the middle of the room, unsure of what to do. Finally, Julian raised his head, his face a neutral mask. "Kaelan, come in, have a seat." Kaelan crossed the vast expanse of the room and sat in the leather chair opposite the desk, his heart still hammering. Julian Croft's presence was even more intimidating in the quiet sanctum of his office. "So," Julian began, his voice calm and measured, "how is your first day progressing?" Kaelan swallowed, trying to keep his own voice steady. "It's going well, sir. I've been working my way through the reports Miss Sterling gave me. Everything's been very smooth so far." Julian nodded, setting the papers aside. His gaze sharpened, studying Kaelan more intently now. "That's good to hear." For a moment there was only silence. Julian leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Kaelan's face. There was a strange quality to his stare, as if he were searching for something, trying to place a half-remembered face. Kaelan felt the tension in the room mount. "Was there something specific you wanted to discuss with me, Mr. Croft?" Julian's expression remained unchanged. "You're new here, Kaelan, just starting your career. But your name? It caught my attention." Kaelan's chest tightened. "My name?" "Yes?" Julian's eyes narrowed for just a fraction of a second before he leaned forward slightly. "Sinclair, isn't it?" Kaelan nodded slowly, his mind racing, trying to understand where this was going. "Yes, sir. Kaelan Sinclair." Julian's gaze lingered on him for another long moment, and then he leaned back again, his face unreadable. "It's a strong name. It reminds me of someone I knew once." Kaelan's heart was now thudding in his chest, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. He could feel the weight of Julian's words hanging in the air. Was it possible? Did Julian know? Had he somehow, in this brief strange conversation, pieced together who Kaelan really was? But Julian didn't press any further. Instead, he offered a faint professional smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I like to keep an eye on the new talent joining our company. We expect great things from you, Kaelan. Keep up the good work." Kaelan forced a nod, unsure of what else to say. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." Julian glanced down at the papers on his desk, a clear signal that the meeting was over. "Good. You can get back to it then." Kaelan stood, his legs feeling unsteady as he made his way to the door. Just as he reached for the handle, Julian's voice stopped him. "Oh, and Kaelan." Kaelan turned, his hand still on the doorknob. "If you ever need anything," Julian said, his tone still calm but now laced with something Kaelan couldn't quite decipher, "my door is always open." Kaelan nodded again, swallowing hard. "I'll keep that in mind." With that, he stepped out of the office, his heart still racing. The door clicked softly shut behind him, and Kaelan stood in the silent hallway, trying to process what had just occurred. There was absolutely no reason for Julian Croft to take a personal interest in him, no reason to call him into his office on his very first day. And yet, something about the way Julian had looked at him, the way he had mentioned his name, it felt like far more than a simple coincidence. The elevator ride back down felt impossibly long. As Kaelan returned to his desk, The ambient noise of the office washed over him, but it did little to quell the unease twisting in his gut. His mother had been right. There was something off about this place, and Kaelan couldn't shake the chilling feeling that he was missing a very important piece of the puzzle. The key clicked in the lock as Kaelan pushed open the apartment door, the familiar scent of home enveloping him, his mother's cooking, the faint hint of lavender from her cleaning, a general sense of comfort that was almost enough to dispel the strange tension that had shadowed him all day. Almost. He set his briefcase down by the door, loosening his tie as he moved into the living room. Elara was on the couch, a book open in her lap, though her eyes were unfocused, staring into the middle distance. She looked up as he entered, her expression difficult to read. "How was it?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of something he couldn't place. Kaelan hesitated, unsure how to distill the day's events, the initial thrill of a new beginning, the unsettling feeling of being watched, of being somehow known, Julian Croft's eyes, that flicker of recognition. It had been a confusing whirlwind of excitement and unease. "It was fine," Kaelan said, trying to inject a note of conviction into his voice as he sank onto the couch beside her. "Busy. They have me reviewing a lot of reports, just getting a feel for everything." Elara nodded slowly, but her gaze lingered on him a moment too long. "She wasn't buying it. Did anything unusual happen?" Kaelan paused, debating how much to reveal. There was no use hiding it. His mother was already on edge. "Well, actually, I met Julian Croft today." Elara's hand tightened on the edge of her book. "You met him?" Kaelan nodded. "Yeah, he called me up to his office. I have no idea why. It was strange. I mean, he's the CEO. Why would he care about some new guy?" Elara remained silent, her eyes darkening as she looked away. Kaelan noticed the sudden tension in her posture, the way her shoulders stiffened at the mention of Julian's name. She wasn't surprised, not in the way he'd expected. Something else was happening here. He leaned closer, his voice softening. "Mom, what is it? Why are you acting this way?" Elara's breath hitched. She placed her book on the coffee table, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. "Kaelan, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a very long time ago." Kaelan frowned, a knot forming in his stomach. "What do you mean?" She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength, before speaking. "Julian Croft. He's not just your boss." Kaelan's pulse hammered, a cold wave of confusion washing over him. What are you talking about?" Elara's eyes, filled with years of regret and pain, finally met his. "He's your father, Kaelan." For a second, the words failed to compute. Kaelan blinked, his mind scrambling to process the impossible statement. His father? Julian Croft? The Julian Croft? What? Kaelan's voice was a choked whisper. "That can't be right." Elara nodded, her own voice shaky but firm. "It's true. Julian and we were involved a long time ago." "Before you were born." Kaelan shook his head, disbelief crashing over him. "But you said my father left." "You never told me who he was. He shot to his feet, running a hand through his hair as his mind raced. "How could you keep this from me? How could you not tell me?" Elara rose as well, her hands wringing together. "I was trying to protect you, Kaelan. I didn't want you growing up knowing what kind of man he truly is." "What kind of man?" Kaelan's voice rose, a raw mix of anger and shock. "You didn't think I deserved to know? To know who my own father is?" Tears welled in Elara's eyes, but she held his gaze. "I didn't want you to be hurt. Julian, he didn't want you. When I told him I was pregnant, he fired me. He cut me off completely. And when I tried to find other work, he made sure I couldn't. He blacklisted me from the entire industry." Kaelan froze, the full weight of her words crashing down on him. "He blacklisted you?" Elara nodded, wiping at her eyes. "Yes, I couldn't get a job anywhere after that. I had no income, no support. It was just you and me, and I had to fight for every scrap to make ends meet. He didn't care. He just wanted me gone, and he used all his power to make sure I couldn't come back." Kaelan's stomach churned. The man he had looked up to, the man he had just met in his pristine office, his father, had done this, had left his mother destitute, had abandoned him before he even had a chance to be born? "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Kaelan asked, his voice quieter now but thick with hurt. "All these years I've wondered about him. I've asked you and you never said a word. Why now?" Elara's face crumpled, and she sank back onto the couch, her hands trembling. "I thought I could keep it buried forever. I never wanted you to know the kind of man he is. But when you told me you got a job at Croft Enterprises, I couldn't keep it from you any longer. You deserve to know the truth, Kaelan. I didn't know how to say it." Kaelan stood there, staring at her, his chest tight with a maelstrom of emotions. Anger, confusion, profound sadness. His entire life had been built on a hidden truth, and now it was all unraveling. A wave of nausea washed over him. Julian Croft, his father, had known about him all this time, and not only had he abandoned them, he had actively worked to destroy his mother's life. "I can't believe this," Kaelan said, shaking his head. "I've been working for him, sitting in his office like I was just another employee. And all this time he knew?" "He doesn't know who you are," Elara said, her voice weak. "He didn't recognize you, Kaelan. He doesn't know. That's not the point." Kaelan's voice cracked, a surge of raw anger breaking through. "He abandoned us, Mom. He destroyed your life. And now I'm supposed to just sit there and work for him as if none of it ever happened?" Elara looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "I didn't tell you this to make you hate him. I told you because I couldn't let you walk into that place without knowing the truth. I didn't want you getting close to him, only to be hurt all over again." Kaelan's chest heaved as he struggled to breathe. His entire life he had pictured his father as a simple mystery, a man who had just walked away. The reality was so much more sinister. He paced the small room, running his hands over his face. "I don't even know what to do now. Do I confront him? Do I quit?" Elara stood and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "That's your choice, Kaelan. But you need to think very carefully. Julian is a powerful man. He could ruin you, just like he ruined me." Kaelan met her gaze, the fire still burning in his chest. "I'm not afraid of him. He can't hurt me the way he hurt you." Elara sighed, her face filled with worry. "I just want you to be safe." Kaelan stared at her, the weight of it all crashing down. He had no idea what his next move would be. But one thing was certain. He could not continue working for Julian Croft as if nothing had happened. He couldn't pretend the man who had abandoned him and destroyed his mother's life was just another CEO. "I'll figure it out," he said finally, his voice tight. "But I can't keep working there." "Not after this," Elara nodded, her expression softening. "Whatever you decide, Kaelan, I'm with you." Kaelan took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm raging inside him. The job he had seen as his big break now felt like a profound betrayal, and the man he had looked up to, his own father, was a monster, a stranger who had inflicted more damage than he could have ever imagined. As he sat down beside his mother, Kaelan felt the crushing weight of the truth settle into his very bones. The life he had known was gone, and now he had to decide what to do with the shattered pieces. The subway rumbled beneath Kaelan's feet as he stared blankly out the window, his reflection a ghostly image in the dark tunnels. It had been 2 days since his mother revealed the truth, 2 days since the foundation of his world had crumbled. He still couldn't fully process it. Julian Croft was his father. Kaelan's fists clenched, the thought sinking deeper and angrier with each repetition. His father, the man he had met on his first day at Croft Enterprises, had looked at him with the detached curiosity one might afford a new piece of office furniture. This was the man who had ruined his mother's career, blacklisted her, and walked away from his own child without a shred of remorse. And now Kaelan was working under him, a living, breathing secret in his own father's empire. The train screeched to a halt, jolting Kaelan from his dark thoughts. He had to pull himself together before walking into that office. He couldn't let anyone see the turmoil raging just beneath the surface. Not yet, not until he knew what to do. The cold morning air hit him as he emerged from the station. Croft Enterprises loomed ahead, its sleek glass tower a monument against the sky. What had once seemed like a symbol of his bright future now felt like a gilded cage, trapping him in a twisted legacy he never knew he was a part of. The office was buzzing with its usual energy when Kaelan walked in, the ringing of phones, the low hum of voices, the steady, rhythmic tapping of keyboards. No one paid him any mind as he made his way to his desk, which suited him perfectly. He needed to think. But the moment he sat down, the weight of his new reality crashed down on him again. He opened his laptop, the cursor blinking expectantly, but he couldn't focus. Every task felt hollow, meaningless, in the shadow of this devastating truth. How could he sit here and pretend everything was normal? How could he work for a man who had so callously abandoned him and his mother? The most infuriating part was that Julian didn't even know. Kaelan had seen it in his eyes that day, a brief flicker of something, quickly dismissed. To Julian, he was just another name on a payroll, another face in the crowd. He had no idea who Kaelan truly was, and that ignorance made Kaelan's blood boil. He glanced across the office to where Julian's assistant sat guard outside the corner office. The door was closed, as it usually was, but Kaelan could vividly picture him in there, sitting behind his massive desk, calm and in command, running his empire while the truth of his past remained safely buried. Not for much longer, Kaelan thought grimly. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't just sit here, armed with this knowledge, and do nothing. But what was the right move? March into Julian's office and lay it all bare? Confront him in front of the entire company? He had imagined it 100 times, picturing Julian's shocked face as the truth came flooding out. But what then? Julian was powerful, influential. He could easily twist the situation, paint Kaelan as unstable, just as he had done with his mother. Kaelan stared at his screen, the words on the report blurring into an indecipherable mess. He couldn't be reckless. He had to be smart. As the morning dragged on, Kaelan tried to work through the tension that coiled in his shoulders, but every time he looked up, the sight of Julian's office made his skin crawl. The man inside remained completely oblivious to the storm brewing just outside his door. Lunch came and went, though Kaelan barely ate. His mind was a battlefield of conflicting strategies. He couldn't stay here, not working for Julian, but he couldn't just quit either, not without a confrontation. He needed answers. He needed Julian to acknowledge what he had done. But how? As Kaelan returned to his desk, his phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "How are you holding up?" He sighed, typing a quick reply, trying to figure it out. He didn't have the heart to tell her how much worse he felt today, how the anger was solidifying into a cold, hard resolve. Elara had been so worried when he left that morning, her eyes filled with the same fear she had tried to suppress for over 2 decades. She didn't want him hurt the way she had been. But Kaelan couldn't walk away. He had to know why. Why Julian had fired her, blacklisted her, left them with nothing. And he needed Julian to finally understand the lifelong consequences of his actions. The question was how to do that without destroying himself in the process. As the afternoon wore on, Kaelan's frustration grew. His work was purely mechanical, a flimsy distraction from the fury simmering inside him. He kept his head down, but his mind raced. Finally, toward the end of the day, Kaelan made a decision. He couldn't keep suffocating in silence. He had to confront Julian face to face. No games! But he couldn't do it here, in the middle of the office, on Julian's home turf where he held all the power. Kaelan stood from his desk, his heart pounding with a new sense of purpose. He needed a plan, a way to catch Julian off guard in a setting where he wasn't in control. Somewhere outside this building, where Kaelan could speak his truth without interruption. As he packed his things, an idea began to take shape. He had overheard some senior staff discussing Julian's dinner plans. Apparently, Julian and his family were regulars at a high-end restaurant not far from the office, a place where they could be seen, where Julian could display his success to the city's elite. Kaelan's jaw tightened. That was his chance. He would go there. He would show up unannounced and confront Julian in front of the very people whose opinions he valued most. He would make him face the truth, make him acknowledge what he had done to Elara, to Kaelan. And he would do it where Julian couldn't hide behind his office door. The plan was risky, but it was something. It gave him a direction, a way to channel the anger that had been consuming him. He couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't let Julian continue living his comfortable lie. That evening, Kaelan sat on the subway, the lights flickering overhead as the train hurtled through the tunnels. His hands were clenched into tight fists in his lap, his mind laser-focused on what he was about to do. He was nervous, of course. He had no idea how Julian would react, no idea if this would detonate in his face. But he didn't care. He had to do this. He couldn't let Julian get away with it all without ever facing the consequences. When he arrived at the restaurant, it was exactly as he'd imagined. An exclusive place with shimmering glass windows and soft, intimate lighting. the kind of establishment where people went to be seen. As Kaelan stood outside watching the patrons through the glass, he saw him almost immediately. Julian was sitting at a table near the window, his wife Isabella beside him, and their son Leo across from them. They were laughing, enjoying their meal, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break over their perfect world. Kaelan's heart hammered against his ribs as he pushed through the heavy door, his mind fixed on one singular goal, making Julian Croft finally see him for who he really was. He approached the table, the ambient noise of the restaurant fading into a dull roar in his ears. Julian didn't notice him at first, too engrossed in telling a story to his wife, gesturing with his hands. But then, as Kaelan drew closer, Julian's eyes lifted and froze. The recognition was instantaneous. Julian's face tightened, his smile vanishing as he locked eyes with Kaelan. For a brief, charged moment, there was only a thick, crackling silence between them. Kaelan stopped at the edge of the table, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The moment everything would come crashing down. The restaurant buzzed with the quiet hum of polite conversation, the gentle clinking of silverware on china, and the soft chime of glasses raised in toast. It was a place of polished elegance where people came to be seen but never to be heard too loudly. Kaelan stood at the entrance, his heart racing as he watched the man who had been a lifelong mystery, now so close he could almost reach out and touch him. Julian Croft sat at a corner table, his back to the window, with his wife Isabella, whose perfectly coiffed hair caught the light from the chandeliers. Across from them sat their son, Leo, looking every inch the heir apparent being groomed for success. They were laughing, utterly unaware of the storm that was bearing down on them. Kaelan swallowed hard, his palms damp. He had rehearsed this moment, but now that it was here, doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve. His fingers twitched as he approached their table, each step feeling heavier than the last. Julian looked up first, their gazes locking across the room, and Kaelan saw it instantly. The flicker of recognition, followed by the sharp tightening of Julian's jaw. The easy smile that had been on his face a moment before evaporated, replaced by something cold and guarded. For a second, neither of them moved. Kaelan's heart hammered in his chest, and Julian's eyes hardened, his body tensing as if bracing for a blow. Kaelan reached the table, standing just a foot away, his presence casting a sudden shadow over their perfect family dinner. "Kaelan," Julian said, his voice a low growl, his eyes darting quickly to his wife and son before snapping back to him. "What are you doing here?" Kaelan felt his own pulse quicken. Julian's tone wasn't welcoming. It was defensive, controlled. He glanced at Isabella and Leo, who were now staring at him with open confusion. "I'm here for the same reason you are, Julian," Kaelan said, his voice steady but laced with tension. "Dinner?" Isabella raised an eyebrow, turning to her husband. "Julian, is this someone from the office?" Julian cleared his throat, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Kaelan is a new employee." "A new employee?" Isabella repeated, her eyes shifting between them, sensing the wrongness of the situation. Leo, sitting across the table, leaned forward, looking Kaelan up and down. "Doesn't look like a typical work meeting, Dad. What's going on?" Kaelan clenched his fists at his sides, his chest tight with the weight of unspoken history. He could feel Julian's gaze burning into him, a silent command to back down, to walk away. But Kaelan had come too far to retreat now. "I'm not here about work," Kaelan stated, his voice firmer, aimed squarely at Julian. "I'm here about something else, something that happened a long time ago." Julian's expression darkened, his shoulders squaring. For the first time, Kaelan saw a flicker of something like fear in his eyes. Isabella, sensing the shift, leaned closer to her husband, her brows furrowed. "Julian," she asked quietly, "what is he talking about?" Julian didn't answer right away. He reached for his wineglass, his hand steady, but his grip unnaturally tight. He took a slow sip, his gaze never leaving Kaelan. "This isn't the time or the place for this, Kaelan." But Kaelan ignored him, his eyes darting to Isabella and then to Leo before settling back on Julian. "I think it's exactly the time and place." There was a long, stretched pause, the kind that precedes a dam breaking. Kaelan's voice dropped, now filled with a barely restrained anger. "You know who I am, don't you?" Julian's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with something Kaelan couldn't quite name. Panic, perhaps, or fury at being cornered. Kaelan, he said quietly, trying to maintain control, we can discuss this another time. No, Kaelan said, his voice rising slightly. We'll talk about it now. In front of them. Leo frowned, glancing at his father. Dad, what is he talking about? Isabella's hand touched Julian's arm, concern etched on her face. Julian, what's going on? Why is he so angry? Julian's face was a stony mask, his eyes locked on Kaelan, but the rigid tension in his posture was a dead giveaway. He didn't want this to happen here. He didn't want the truth to come out, and that only fueled Kaelan's resolve. Kaelan took a breath, steadying himself. I'm not just some new employee at your company. I'm the son you abandoned. Isabella's eyes widened, her hand freezing midair. What? Leo's expression shifted from confusion to shock, his mouth hanging slightly open as he looked from Kaelan to his father. Julian remained silent, his face pale, his jaw tight. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. Kaelan took another step closer, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. 24 years ago, you fired my mother. You blacklisted her from the industry. You left her with nothing and you walked away. And now I'm standing here, working for you, while you sit here and pretend none of it ever happened. Isabella's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Julian, is this true? Leo's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he stared at his father. Dad, what is he talking about? Julian said nothing. The weight of the truth hung in the air, too heavy to be brushed aside, too real to be denied. His silence was the only confirmation they needed. Isabella's eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling as she looked at her husband. You have another child? You did this to someone and you never told me. Kaelan felt the knot in his chest loosen just slightly as the truth finally shattered the pristine facade of Julian's life. He looked at Julian, his anger giving way to something else, something almost like pity. You ruined her life, Kaelan continued, his voice quieter now, more controlled. You left us with nothing, and you think you can just go on living as if none of it ever happened? Julian's face had drained of all color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time, Kaelan saw him not as the all-powerful CEO, but as a man caught in the wreckage of his own lies. Isabella's voice cut through the tension, barely a whisper. Julian, how could you? Julian finally spoke, his voice hoarse, weak. I made a mistake. I didn't think. You didn't think it would ever come back to haunt you, Kaelan finished for him. But it did. Leo's face hardened, his eyes flashing with anger as he stared at his father. Dad, you seriously did this? You have a son you never told us about? Julian's hand trembled as he set his glass down, his eyes flicking between his family and Kaelan, trapped in a moment he could no longer control. I thought it was over. I didn't want to hurt anyone. Kaelan shook his head, bitterness creeping into his voice. It's never over, Julian. You hurt my mother. You hurt me. And now you're going to have to face that. For a moment no one spoke. The restaurant's quiet hum seemed to have vanished, leaving only the crushing weight of the truth hanging in the air. Isabella's tears fell silently, her gaze locked on the man she thought she knew. Leo's hands clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles white with rage. Julian's eyes finally met Kaelan's again, and this time there was no more denial, only the heavy burden of a past that had finally, irrevocably caught up with him. The restaurant felt cold now, the soft glow of the chandeliers casting long, distorted shadows over the table. The hum of conversation around them continued, oblivious to the drama unfolding, but at Julian Croft's table, the world had ground to a halt. Isabella wiped at her tears, her hand trembling as she placed it on the table. Julian, she whispered, her voice thick with disbelief, you've been lying to me, to us, for all these years. Julian sat motionless, his face drained of color, his gaze fixed on the wine glass before him. His hands, usually so steady and commanding, trembled slightly. He looked smaller now, as if the weight of his own deceit had finally pressed him down into his chair. Leo leaned forward, his voice tight, with a mixture of anger and betrayal. You have another son? You ruined someone's life and just thought we'd never find out? Kaelan stood at the edge of the table, his chest heaving with a storm of emotions. Rage, hurt, and a sliver of dark vindication. The truth was finally exposed, and now Julian couldn't hide behind his power or his wealth. He couldn't pretend anymore. Julian's eyes flickered to Kaelan for a brief moment, then back to his wife and son. I didn't want to hurt you, he began, his voice hoarse. I thought it was over. It was a mistake, a long time ago. A mistake? Kaelan's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. You didn't just make a mistake. You destroyed my mother's life. You blacklisted her. You left her with nothing. Isabella gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. You blacklisted her? Her voice cracked with disbelief. Julian, how could you do something like that? Julian's face contorted, the calm, composed mask he had worn for decades, finally crumbling. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked cornered, trapped by the past that had finally surfaced. I had no choice, Julian finally managed, his voice low, almost a plea. I couldn't let it come out. I had a family, a career. I had to protect everything I'd built. Leo shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. So you protected yourself and just left them to suffer? His voice was full of disgust. You didn't care about them. You just cared about your reputation. Kaelan watched as the man who had always seemed untouchable now looked utterly defeated. Julian's hand shook as he reached for his glass, taking a long sip of wine. His gaze was unfocused, as if he couldn't bear to meet anyone's eyes. Isabella's tears fell silently as she shook her head. I trusted you, Julian. I built a life with you. How could you lie to me like this? How could you do this to your own child? The word child seemed to hang in the air, its full weight settling over the table. Julian's face twisted with guilt, his eyes finally lifting to meet Isabella's. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought if I buried it, it would just go away, that I could protect you from it. Isabella let out a bitter, broken laugh. Protect me from the truth? You didn't protect anyone, Julian. You just protected yourself. Kaelan stood there, his fists clenched at his sides. You thought you could just erase us, pretend like we didn't exist. But we do exist, Julian. We're real, and we've been living with the consequences of your choices every single day. Julian's eyes flickered with something that might have been shame, but it was too little, too late. He had built his empire in comfort while Elara had struggled to raise Kaelan alone. There was no excuse, no justification that could ever atone for that. Leo's face was hard, his voice dripping with disgust. You lied to us, Dad. You built this perfect family on a lie, didn't you? How many other secrets are there? How many other people have you hurt? Julian shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. There's no one else. I swear, do you expect us to believe you? Isabella's voice cracked again, her eyes red and swollen. After all this? You've been lying to me for over 20 years, Julian. I don't even know who you are anymore. Kaelan's heart twisted at the sight of Isabella's pain. She was another victim, caught in the crossfire of her husband's past. But he couldn't allow himself to feel pity, not yet. She was a victim of Julian's lies, just as he and his mother were. You're not the only one he hurt, Kaelan said quietly, his voice filled with a cold anger. My mother, Elara, she tried to get back on her feet after you fired her. She tried to find work, but every door was slammed in her face. You blacklisted her. You ruined her reputation. We struggled for years while you sat here, living in luxury. Isabella's face crumpled as the full weight of Kaelan's words sank in. She turned to Julian, her voice barely above a whisper. You did that to her? You ruined her life just to protect your own? Julian's hands trembled as he set his glass down, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic guilt. I didn't know what else to do, he said weakly. I was scared. Scared? Leo spat, his voice rising. That's your excuse? You were scared? Kaelan felt the rage bubble up inside him again, but this time it was for his mother, for all the years she had sacrificed, all the struggles she had endured. Julian's fear had cost them everything. You don't get to be scared, Kaelan said, his voice trembling with anger. You didn't lose everything. We did. Julian looked up at Kaelan, his eyes filled with something that almost resembled remorse. I'm sorry, he whispered, the words hollow and weak. I'm so sorry. But Kaelan wasn't interested in apologies. Not now. Sorry doesn't change a thing, Kaelan said, his voice cold. It doesn't fix what you did. You don't get to say sorry and walk away. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but Isabella cut him off, her voice shaking with rage. Kaelan's right. You don't get to fix this with an apology, Julian. You lied to us. and you destroyed their lives." She turned to Kaelan, her expression softening as fresh tears welled. "I'm so sorry, Kaelan. I didn't know. I didn't know any of this." Kaelan looked at her, his anger still simmering, but he gave a slight nod. "I know. This isn't your fault." Leo, who had been silent for a moment, spoke again, his voice filled with disbelief. "So what now? What are we supposed to do with this, Dad? Just pretend like nothing happened?" Julian didn't respond. He looked down at the table, his hands shaking, his face pale. The man who had once seemed so powerful, so untouchable, was now just a shell. "We can't pretend any more," Isabella said quietly, her voice filled with pain. "We have to face this." Kaelan's chest tightened as he watched Julian, this man who had caused so much damage, sitting there in silence, unable to answer for his sins. The truth had finally caught up to him, and the family he had built on lies was crumbling around him. "I've said what I needed to say," Kaelan said, his voice steady but cold. "Now it's up to you to figure out how to live with it." Isabella's tears fell freely, and even Leo, who had been so full of rage, now just looked lost. The weight of Julian's betrayal had shattered their world, and there was no going back. Julian finally looked up, his voice barely a whisper. I'll fix this. I'll make it right." But Kaelan just shook his head. "You can't fix this, Julian. You can't undo what you've done." With that, Kaelan turned and walked away from the table, leaving them to grapple with the wreckage of the truth. As he walked out of the restaurant, the heavy weight on his chest loosened, just a little. The confrontation was over. The truth was out. But the damage had been done, and there was no turning back. The buzz around the office at Croft Enterprises was different today. Conversations that were usually light and professional now had a sharp, gossipy edge. Eyes darted toward Julian Croft's office, the glass walls suddenly seeming more transparent than ever, as if everyone could see the cracks forming around the man who had built this empire. Kaelan sat at his desk, watching the subtle shifts in the office dynamics. The news had spread like wildfire, and the whispers had escalated into open discussions. Everyone knew Julian Croft, the untouchable CEO, was no longer invincible. He stared at the report on his screen, the words a meaningless blur. He should have felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that the man who had destroyed his mother's life was finally facing the consequences. Instead, a quiet emptiness settled within him. The raw anger that had propelled him to that restaurant was no longer burning so fiercely. Now there was only the fallout. His phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. A text from his mother. "How are you?" Kaelan sighed, typing a reply. "It's all over the office. Everyone knows." Her response came almost instantly. "Are you okay?" He hesitated before answering. "I think so. Just trying to figure out what comes next." Kaelan leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the far end of the office, where Julian's door remained closed. No one had seen him come in today, and the rumor mill was already churning. Some said he was holed up at home, avoiding the public humiliation. Others speculated he was meeting with lawyers, trying to salvage what was left of his reputation. It didn't matter. The truth was out, and there was no putting it back. Around noon, Kaelan's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a company-wide email. The subject line was stark and simple. Company announcement. His heart raced as he clicked it open. "Dear team, effective immediately, Julian Croft has stepped down from his role as CEO of Croft Enterprises. The board of directors has appointed an interim CEO while the company transitions through this period. We remain committed to our values and will continue to uphold the integrity and reputation of the company. Thank you for your continued dedication during this time." Kaelan's hand tightened around his phone. It was done. Julian was out. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the email, letting the words sink in. The man who had wielded so much power, who had made life-altering decisions without a second thought, had finally lost his throne. But it wasn't the victory Kaelan had imagined. He had pictured this moment so many times, Julian's downfall, his public disgrace. But now that it was real, it didn't feel the way he thought it would. There was no rush of triumph, no sense of closure. It just felt hollow. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. Another text from his mother. "I just saw the news. Are you okay with this?" He stared at the message before replying, "Yeah, he's done." but it doesn't feel like I thought it would." Her response was slower this time, more considered. "It won't feel like you expected, Kaelan. But you did what you had to do. You faced him. That's what matters." Kaelan closed his eyes, letting her words wash over him. She was right. He had done what was necessary. The truth was out, and Julian was gone. But the cost of it all still weighed heavily on his chest. Later that afternoon, the office whispers had evolved into full-blown discussions. Kaelan kept his head down, avoiding the curious glances some of his colleagues sent his way. He didn't want to be part of the gossip, didn't want to be the center of this drama. He just wanted to get through the day. But as the hours dragged on, he knew he couldn't avoid the reality of what had happened, not just to Julian, but to himself. He had spent so long building up to that moment of confrontation, so long imagining what it would feel like to finally make Julian Croft pay. Now that it was over, Kaelan was left with the aftermath. He was still an employee at the company Julian had built, a company founded in part on a foundation of lies. A soft knock on his desk pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see his supervisor, Ms. Sterling, standing there, her face unreadable. "Can we talk for a minute?" she asked, her voice calm but serious. Kaelan nodded, following her to a small, quiet conference room. The room had glass walls that offered a view of the bustling office outside. Ms. Sterling closed the door behind them, folding her arms across her chest. "So," she began, her tone measured, "I'm sure you've seen the news." Kaelan nodded, unsure where this was going. "Yeah." She watched him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I know about your connection to Julian." Kaelan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected that. "You do?" Mr. Sterling nodded slowly. "Word gets around. I don't know all the details, but people are talking." Kaelan felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the fear of being exposed. "What exactly are they saying?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Mostly that you're his son, that the confrontation at the restaurant wasn't exactly private." Kaelan's stomach dropped. He hadn't considered that. The restaurant had been full of people who were probably just as interested in gossip as they were in their food. Of course, word would spread. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Kaelan said, his voice low. I needed to confront him." Ms. Sterling nodded, her expression softening. "I get it, and I don't blame you. But you need to be careful, Kaelan. This company is going through a turbulent time. With Julian stepping down, there's going to be a lot of scrutiny. People will be watching you." Kaelan swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you need to decide what you want to do," she said quietly. "Staying here, working at the company your father built, it's going to come with challenges. People will ask questions, and they'll want answers." Kaelan stared at her, his mind racing. He hadn't thought about the aftermath, about working here in the shadow of his father's legacy. It wasn't just about the job anymore. "You don't have to decide right now," Mrs. Sterling added, her voice softer. "But think about it. This place is changing, and you need to figure out if you want to be a part of that change." Kaelan nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. "Thanks. I'll think about it." Ms. Sterling gave him a small nod before leaving the room, leaving Kaelan alone with his thoughts. By the time he left the office that evening, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city. He walked slowly, his mind heavy. Julian was gone, forced out by the truth Kaelan had exposed. But now Kaelan was left with a choice. Could he stay at Croft Enterprises, knowing the history that lay beneath its success? Or was it time to move on, to leave the shadow of his father behind and forge a new path? He didn't have an answer yet. All he knew was that the truth had changed everything, and now he had to figure out where he stood in the aftermath. As he reached his apartment, his phone buzzed again. Another text from his mother. "Come home. We'll figure this out together." Kaelan smiled faintly, the weight on his chest lifting just a little. He had confronted the past. Now it was time to decide what kind of future he wanted to build. Kaelan sat at the kitchen table, the familiar warmth of his mother's apartment a comforting blanket around him. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the soft hum of the radio, a peaceful soundscape that stood in stark contrast to the turmoil of the past few days. Elara was at the stove, her back to him, stirring a pot of oatmeal. She hadn't said much since he'd arrived the night before, and Kaelan knew she was giving him space, waiting for him to tell her what came next. He hadn't figured that out yet, but here, in this small, familiar space, the world didn't seem quite so heavy. Elara turned from the stove, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You want to talk about it?" Kaelan looked up at her, the weariness settled deep in his bones. He stepped down. "Julian's gone. The company made the announcement." Elara's eyes softened as she sat down across from him. "I heard. It's all over the news. They're calling it a scandal." Kaelan nodded, rubbing his hands together. "It doesn't feel like I thought it would, Mom. I don't know. I thought I'd feel something more. Relief, maybe. Satisfaction. But I don't." Elara reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "And that's because this isn't just about him. It's about everything we went through. And nothing he does now can ever undo what happened." Kaelan looked down at her hand, at the lines of wear and resilience etched into her skin. She had endured so much, carried so much for so long. And even with Julian gone, the scars remained. "I don't know what to do next," Kaelan admitted, his voice quiet. "Staying at the company feels wrong, but leaving, I don't know if that's the answer either." Elara nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "You don't have to decide everything right now, Kaelan. You've already done the hardest part. You faced him. You made him own up to what he did." Kaelan swallowed hard, the memory of that confrontation still raw. "I just keep thinking about all those years, all the times I asked about my father, and you couldn't tell me the truth. And now that I know, it feels like it wasn't worth it." Elara's expression softened, and she leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "It was worth it, Kaelan. You deserved to know the truth, and no matter how painful it was, you needed to hear it." Kaelan let out a shaky breath, her words sinking in. She was right. The truth had shattered the idealized image of the father he'd imagined, but it was still his truth. And now, with everything exposed, he could finally begin to move forward. "I just don't know where to go from here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Elara's hand tightened around his. "You're strong, Kaelan, stronger than you know. You've been through all of this, and you've come out the other side. And now you get to decide what happens next. You get to build the life you want, without anyone holding you back." Kaelan met her eyes, and for the first time in days he felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "You're right," he said softly. "I can move on from this," Elara smiled. A small, tired smile, but one that held a world of strength. "We both can." The day passed slowly, filled with small, healing moments. Kaelan stayed with his mother, helping around the apartment, cooking dinner, and sharing stories about anything and everything except Julian Croft. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they allowed themselves to simply be together, without the weight of the past suffocating them. Later that evening, as they sat on the couch watching an old sitcom, Kaelan turned to Elara, a question that had been on his mind all day finally surfacing. Do you think we'll ever get real justice for what he did?" he asked quietly. Elara's gaze remained on the TV, her face thoughtful. "We already have, in a way." Kaelan frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" She turned to him, her expression calm and resolute. "Justice isn't always about punishment, Kaelan. Sometimes it's about survival. Julian may have destroyed my career, but he didn't destroy me. I raised you. We survived. And now we're stronger than we ever would have been if he'd stayed in our lives." Kaelan stared at her, the depth of her words sinking in. She was right. They had survived. Despite everything Julian had done, despite the obstacles he had thrown in their path, they had built a life. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't always been fair, but they had made it through. "Justice isn't just about seeing him fall," Elara continued, her voice steady. "It's about us standing tall, and we're still standing." A lump rose in Kaelan's throat, the emotions swirling inside him too complex for words. He had spent so long focused on the idea of bringing Julian down, of making him pay. But now, sitting here with his mother, he realized that the real victory was in the fact that they had made it this far, despite everything. "I guess you're right," Kaelan said softly, a small smile touching his lips. "We're still here." Elara squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with pride. "And we always will be." The next morning, Kaelan woke up feeling lighter than he had in days. The weight of the past was still there, a part of his story, but it no longer felt like an anchor dragging him down. He stood in the kitchen, making coffee as the early morning light streamed through the window. The world outside was quiet, peaceful. As he poured 2 cups, he thought about the choices that lay ahead. He could stay at Croft Enterprises, but the more he considered it, the more he realized that the company represented everything he wanted to leave behind. It was Julian's legacy, not his. He needed to start fresh, to build something of his own, untainted by the shadow of his father's past. Elara walked into the kitchen, still in her robe, and smiled when she saw him. "Morning," she said, her voice soft and warm. "Morning," Kaelan replied, handing her a cup of coffee. They sat at the table together, the quiet stillness of the morning settling over them. For a long time neither of them spoke. There was a newfound peace between them, a sense of understanding that had been forged in the fire. Finally, Kaelan broke the silence. "I think I'm going to leave Croft Enterprises." Elara looked at him, her expression calm and supportive. "You don't have to make that decision right now." "I know," Kaelan said, taking a sip of his coffee. "But I think it's the right move. I can't stay there working in the shadow of what he did. I need to do something else. Something that's mine." Elara nodded, pride shining in her eyes. "I think that's a wonderful idea." Kaelan smiled, a weight lifting from his chest. "Yeah, it is." They sat there for a while longer, talking about the future, about the possibilities that lay ahead. For the first time in years, Kaelan felt like he was in control of his own life. The past would always be there, but it no longer had the power to define him. He had faced his father, he had uncovered the truth, and now he was free to build the life he wanted, one defined by his choices, not Julian's mistakes. As the morning sun rose higher in the sky, Kaelan looked over at his mother, his heart full of gratitude for everything they had endured together. "We made it," he said quietly, a small smile on his lips. Elara smiled back, her eyes filled with love and pride. "Yes, we did."